On a brutal February night in 1841, 17-year-old Eliza Monroe was dragged through a Mississippi blizzard toward the plantation's Icehouse, where her master Harrison Bellamy planned to lock her inside as punishment for what he called uppity behavior. But when that heavy wooden door slammed shut, it wasn't Eliza who found herself trapped in the frozen tomb. By sunrise, the entire Bellamy family lay dead in their own ice house while Eliza vanished into the storm, leaving behind only a rusty key hanging from the door latch and whispers of the ice witch of Natchez that would haunt the region for decades. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Bellamy plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of Mississippi Delta bottomland, its manor house rising like a white monument to wealth built on human suffering. Harrison Bellamy had inherited the property from his grandfather, along with 200 enslaved souls and a reputation for cruelty that made even his fellow plantation owners uncomfortable during their polite social gatherings. His wife, Catherine, possessed the delicate beauty of fine china, and twice its fragility, compensating for her physical weakness with a sharp tongue that could strip flesh from bone with carefully chosen words. Their 3 children had absorbed their parents' casual brutality like sponges soaking up spilled wine. 12-year-old Robert showed early promise as a future overseer, delighting in devising creative punishments for slaves who displeased him. 10-year-old twins Margaret and Michael competed to see who could inflict the most psychological damage on the house servants, treating human beings like toys that existed solely for their entertainment. Eliza Monroe had been born into this hell during a particularly harsh winter, her mother dying in childbirth while her father worked the cotton fields under an overseer's whip. She grew up in the slave quarters under the watchful eye of old Sarah, the plantation's cook and unofficial mother to dozens of orphan children whose parents had been sold away or worked to death. Sarah taught Eliza to read using pages torn from discarded newspapers, a skill that would prove both blessing and curse as the girl learned to understand every cruel word spoken about her people. The education came with warnings about keeping such knowledge hidden, for literacy was forbidden to slaves and discovery would mean the loss of fingers or worse. But Eliza possessed a hunger for learning that couldn't be satisfied by the scraps of information that filtered down to the quarters. She memorized every conversation she overheard, every letter and document she glimpsed while cleaning the main house, building a detailed understanding of how the plantation operated and where its weaknesses might be exploited. By age 15, Eliza had been promoted from field work to house servant, a position that brought her into daily contact with the Bellamy family and their casual cruelty. She witnessed Harrison's drunken rages, Catherine's calculated psychological torture, and the children's gleeful participation in maintaining the plantation's reign of terror. Every day brought fresh reminders that she was property rather than person, an object to be used and abused according to her owner's whims. The winter of 1841 arrived early and harsh, coating the plantation in ice and transforming the Mississippi into a frozen wasteland that trapped steamboats and isolated communities for weeks at a time. The plantation's ice house, carved into a hillside behind the main house, became more crucial than ever as the primary means of preserving food through the brutal season. Harrison ordered it filled to capacity with blocks cut from the river, creating a crystalline fortress that maintained sub-freezing temperatures even when the outside air warmed during brief thaws. Eliza's assignment to Icehouse duty came as punishment for what Catherine called impertinent behavior, though the girl's only crime had been failing to hide her disgust when Robert tortured a kitten to death for his own amusement. The work was brutal beyond description, requiring her to spend hours each day in the bone-chilling chamber arranging supplies and maintaining the ice blocks that preserved the family's meat and dairy products. Her thin cotton dress and worn shoes provided no protection against the savage cold that turned her breath to fog and made her fingers too numb to perform even simple tasks. But the Icehouse offered something Eliza had never experienced in her 17 years of bondage: solitude. Away from the constant surveillance and casual cruelty of the main house, she found moments of peace where she could think, plan, and dream of possibilities beyond the plantation's boundaries. She began secreting small items in hidden corners of the chamber, building a cache of supplies that might prove useful if escape ever became possible. Harrison took particular pleasure in checking Eliza's work, arriving without warning to inspect her progress and find fault with her organization of supplies. He would circle her like a predator, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel anticipation in his gray eyes. Sometimes his inspections involved physical contact that left her feeling violated and powerless, his hands exploring places they had no right to touch while he whispered threats about what happened to slave girls who didn't properly appreciate their master's attention. Catherine's cruelty was more subtle but equally devastating, involving psychological torture designed to break Eliza's spirit rather than her body. She would send the girl to the Icehouse on the coldest days, timing the assignments to maximize suffering while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. When Eliza returned to the house with blue lips and chattering teeth, Catherine would comment sweetly about how the cold brought out the color in her cheeks as if frostbite were a cosmetic enhancement rather than a sign of dangerous exposure. The Bellamy children treated Eliza as their personal entertainment, devising games that involved hiding her possessions, reporting imaginary infractions that would earn her extra punishment, and competing to see who could make her cry first. Robert, despite being only 12, had already developed his father's taste for physical intimidation, once shoving Eliza into a wall hard enough to leave bruises that lasted for weeks. The twins preferred psychological warfare, whispering detailed descriptions of what would happen to runaway slaves who were caught and returned to their masters. As the winter deepened and temperatures plummeted, Eliza began to notice patterns in the family's behavior that might be exploited if the right opportunity arose. Harrison's drinking had increased to the point where he could barely navigate stairs after dinner, while Catherine had started taking larger doses of laudanum to combat what she called her nervous condition. The children, for all their precocious cruelty, were still young enough to be frightened by things that went beyond their understanding or control. The opportunity Eliza had been unconsciously preparing for arrived on February 14, 1841, when the worst blizzard in living memory swept across the Mississippi Delta with winds that howled like banshees and temperatures that dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The storm trapped the plantation in a world of white isolation, cutting off communication with neighboring properties and making travel impossible for anyone foolish enough to venture outside. The family had gathered in the main parlor after dinner, warming themselves by the fireplace while discussing their plans for the following week. Harrison and Catherine were expecting visitors from New Orleans, wealthy relatives who were considering investing in the plantation's expansion into new cotton varieties. The visit was crucial for the family's financial future, requiring perfect presentation of both property and slaves to convince the visitors that their money would be well invested. Eliza moved through the house, completing her evening duties, cleaning dishes and preparing rooms for the expected guests while the storm raged outside. As she worked, she overheard Harrison and Catherine discussing her recent behavior, which they characterized as increasingly bold and disrespectful despite her careful efforts to remain invisible. They had decided that Eliza needed a lesson in humility that would remind her of her proper place in the plantation's hierarchy. The punishment they planned was designed to break both her body and spirit. She would be locked in the Icehouse overnight, with nothing but her thin dress and bare feet to protect her from temperatures that could kill within hours. If she survived until morning, perhaps she would have learned proper gratitude for the warmth and comfort of serving in the main house. If she didn't survive, she was just another piece of property that had outlived its usefulness. Catherine added her own refinements to the torture, suggesting they remove Eliza's shawl and shoes before locking her inside, ensuring that the cold would have maximum impact on her exposed skin. Robert and the twins giggled with excitement at their parents' creativity, already imagining how they would describe Eliza's suffering to their friends at the next social gathering. But as the family discussed their plans with obvious pleasure, Eliza was forming plans of her own. She had spent months in that frozen chamber learning its secrets and understanding how the circulation worked, discovering where warmth could be found and how cold could be weaponized against those who thought they controlled it. If the Bellamys wanted to use the Icehouse against her, she would turn their weapon back on them in ways they could never anticipate. Around 10 o'clock, as the storm reached its peak intensity, Harrison announced it was time to teach their uppity slave a lesson she would never forget. The entire family bundled into heavy coats and boots, preparing to venture into the blizzard for the pleasure of watching Eliza's punishment begin. They made their way through knee-deep snow to the Icehouse, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the ice-covered trees while the wind tried to extinguish the flames. Inside the Icehouse, the temperature was even more brutal than the outdoor air, the thick stone walls and underground construction creating a tomb-like atmosphere that seemed to swallow both sound and warmth. Harrison pushed Eliza roughly toward the center of the chamber, his breath forming great clouds in the frigid air as he explained her punishment with obvious satisfaction. She would spend the night locked in this frozen hell, he announced, with nothing but her cotton dress to keep her warm. If she survived until dawn, perhaps she would have learned proper appreciation for the privileges of serving in the heated main house. If she died from exposure, they would simply purchase a replacement at the next slave market in Natchez. Catherine stepped forward to remove Eliza's thin shawl, claiming that slaves needed to earn the right to warmth through proper behavior and grateful service. Robert and the twins watched with gleeful anticipation, already composing the stories they would tell about the night they watched their parents freeze a slave girl to death for their own entertainment. But as Harrison turned toward the door, preparing to lock Eliza inside the crystalline tomb, she spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the howling wind that penetrated the Icehouse's ventilation system. She asked with apparent concern whether the family would be safe walking back to the house through such a severe storm, noting how the temperature seemed to be dropping even lower as the night progressed. Harrison paused, confused by what seemed like genuine worry from someone about to face a potentially fatal punishment. Catherine laughed harshly, pointing out that they had warm clothes and a heated house waiting for them, luxuries that Eliza would never again take for granted. The children added their own cruel observations about the difference between masters and slaves, between those who commanded comfort and those who endured whatever suffering their betters deemed appropriate. Eliza nodded thoughtfully, as if accepting their explanations, then moved with lightning quickness toward the heavy wooden door. Before anyone could react, she had stepped outside and slammed the barrier shut behind her, trapping the entire Bellamy family inside the frozen chamber they had intended as her death sentence. The massive iron key turned in the lock with a sound like thunder, followed by a moment of stunned silence as the family realized what had happened. Harrison's roar of fury shook the ice-covered walls as he threw himself against the door, demanding that Eliza unlock the chamber immediately and accept whatever punishment he deemed appropriate for her momentary rebellion. Catherine's voice joined her husband's, alternating between threats of horrible torture and promises of mercy if Eliza would just open the door and submit to a reduced penalty for her unthinkable audacity. But Eliza was already walking away from the Icehouse, her stolen winter coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders and her carefully hoarded supplies secured in a canvas bag. Behind her, the voices of the trapped family grew more desperate and less coherent as the brutal cold began affecting their ability to think clearly. The main house stood empty except for the other slaves who were asleep in their quarters and unaware that the plantation's entire power structure was now trapped in a frozen tomb. Eliza moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, gathering additional supplies and items that would help her survive the journey to freedom. From Harrison's study, she took gold coins and paper money that would finance her escape. From Catherine's bedroom, she claimed warm clothing and sturdy boots. From the children's room, she gathered small valuables that could be traded for food and shelter. Most importantly, Eliza spent time in the plantation's record room, where Harrison kept detailed documentation of all his property, both human and material. Using the literacy skills old Sarah had taught her in secret, she carefully altered several key documents, changing her legal status from enslaved property to freed person, and creating papers that would support her claim to independence if questioned by authorities. As she worked by candlelight, Eliza could hear the wind carrying faint sounds from the direction of the Icehouse. The trapped family's voices had grown, weaker and less frequent as the hours passed and hypothermia began claiming their bodies. She felt no pleasure in their suffering, but neither did she experience guilt or regret. They had chosen to use the Icehouse as a weapon against her, and she had simply demonstrated that weapons could be turned against those who wielded them. Before dawn, Eliza made her way to the plantation's stables, where Harrison's prized horses waited in their warm stalls. She selected a sturdy mare named Lightning, an animal she had helped care for during her duties and who recognized her scent and voice. The horse accepted her authority without question, perhaps sensing that this night was different from all others that had come before. As the sun rose over the frozen Mississippi landscape, painting the ice-covered trees in shades of gold and crimson, Eliza mounted Lightning and rode away from the only home she had ever known. Behind her, smoke rose from the chimneys of the slave quarters as her fellow bondspeople began their daily routines, still believing that Master Harrison and his family slept safely in the main house. The road to Natchez stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, winding through forests and fields toward a city where she might find passage on a riverboat traveling to free territory. She had studied maps in Harrison's study, memorizing routes that led to places where slavery was forbidden, and a resourceful young woman might build a new life based on her own choices rather than the whims of cruel masters. Lightning's hooves rang against the frozen ground as they traveled, the mare's warm breath creating clouds in the bitter air while Eliza guided her along roads she had never seen but understood from her secret study of the plantation's business correspondence. Harrison had often traveled these routes on trips to sell cotton and purchase slaves, never imagining that his property was listening and learning from every detail he shared. By midday, Eliza had covered more than 30 miles, putting significant distance between herself and the plantation while following back roads that offered concealment from other travelers. She stopped periodically to rest Lightning and review the documents she had forged, ensuring they would pass casual inspection by anyone who might question her freedom. The altered papers identified her as Elizabeth Washington, a freedwoman from New Orleans traveling north to join relatives in St. Louis. The handwriting matched Harrison's style closely enough to fool most observers, and the official-looking seals she had copied from legitimate documents provided an air of authenticity that should satisfy casual challenges. As evening approached, Eliza began searching for shelter where she could rest and plan the next stage of her escape. She found what she needed in an abandoned cabin set back from the main road, its windows intact and chimney functional, providing protection from the wind that continued to howl across the frozen landscape. Inside the empty structure, Eliza built a small fire using wood from broken furniture and matches from her carefully assembled supplies. The warmth felt miraculous after months of exposure to the Icehouse's brutal cold, and she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to live somewhere that warmth was a right rather than a privilege granted by cruel masters. She prepared her first meal as a free person using food taken from the plantation kitchen, savoring flavors that had been forbidden to her as a slave. The bread was soft and fresh, the cheese rich and creamy, the preserved meat seasoned with spices that had been reserved for the master's table. Each bite represented a small victory, a declaration that she was no longer property to be fed whatever scraps her owners deemed sufficient. As she ate, Eliza thought about the family she had left trapped in the icehouse, wondering whether they had survived the night or succumbed to the cold they had intended as her death sentence. Part of her hoped they would live long enough to understand what she had done and why, to experience the helplessness and terror they had inflicted on others. But another part simply wanted them gone from the world. Their capacity for cruelty ended forever. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of frozen chambers and desperate voices calling her name. When morning arrived, Eliza woke to find frost covering the cabin's windows, a reminder that winter still held the land in its grip, and her journey to freedom was far from complete. She saddled Lightning and resumed her travels toward Natchez, following roads that wound through countryside devastated by the recent blizzard. Fallen trees blocked some routes while ice made others treacherous, but the mare picked her way carefully through the obstacles while Eliza navigated using skills learned from overhearing Harrison's conversations about travel and trade. The second day brought her to Natchez's outskirts, where the great river port sprawled along the Mississippi's banks like a living organism fed by the commerce that flowed up and down America's central waterway. The sight filled Eliza with both hope and terror, for here she would either find the freedom she sought or face capture and return to a bondage that would certainly end in her death. Natchez in 1841 was a cosmopolitan center where cotton flowed south to New Orleans while manufactured goods moved north to supply the plantations and farms of the Mississippi Valley. The docks bustled with steamboats loading cargo and passengers while the streets teemed with merchants, travelers, and workers of every description. For a young black woman with forged papers and a stolen horse, the city offered both opportunity and mortal danger. Eliza had studied the city's layout from maps in Harrison's study, learning the locations of reputable hotels, horse dealers, and steamboat companies that might serve her needs. Her plan was straightforward. Sell Lightning for traveling money, purchase passage on a northbound riverboat, and present her altered documents as proof of her free status. But as she approached the city proper, Eliza realized her plan contained a potentially fatal flaw. Lightning was a distinctive animal, well known throughout the region as Harrison Bellamy's prized mare. Anyone familiar with the plantation would recognize the horse immediately and begin asking questions about how a young black woman had acquired such valuable property. The solution presented itself when she passed a modest livery stable on the city's edge, where a weathered sign advertised horses bought and sold for fair prices. The proprietor, a middle-aged man with honest eyes and calloused hands, looked up from his work as Eliza approached on Lightning. His expression showed surprise at seeing such a fine horse ridden by someone he clearly assumed was enslaved, but his voice remained respectful as he asked how he might assist her. Eliza dismounted and spoke carefully, using the story she had rehearsed during her journey. She was Elizabeth Washington, she explained, a freedwoman whose former master had given her the horse as payment for years of faithful service. Now she was traveling north to join family and needed to convert the animal into cash for her journey. The stable owner examined Lightning with the practiced eye of someone who understood horseflesh, running experienced hands over the mare's legs and checking her teeth and condition. His assessment was professional and honest. The horse was clearly valuable, worth at least $200 in the current market. But selling such a distinctive animal would require discretion to avoid unwanted questions. Eliza's heart sank as she realized the man's caution might trap her in Natchez longer than was safe. Every hour she remained in the area increased her chances of discovery by slave catchers who might already be searching for the escaped property responsible for whatever had happened at the Bellamy plantation. But the stable owner surprised her with an unexpected offer. He had recently received an inquiry from a plantation owner upriver who needed a quality saddle horse and was willing to pay premium prices for the right animal. Lightning would meet the buyer's requirements perfectly, and the transaction could be completed quickly with minimal publicity. The price would be $180, enough to finance Eliza's journey north, with funds remaining for establishing herself in free territory. The sale was completed within hours, with Eliza receiving gold coins that represented more wealth than she had ever imagined possessing. The stable owner asked no uncomfortable questions about her background, treating her with the courtesy due any legitimate customer. As she walked away toward Natchez's riverfront district, Eliza felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that made her steps lighter despite the weight of her travel bag. The Mississippi waterfront presented a bewildering array of choices, with steamboats of every size and description preparing for departures to destinations throughout the river system. Eliza observed the vessels carefully, looking for one that appeared well-maintained and prosperous without being so grand that her presence would attract unwanted attention. She settled on a medium-sized paddle wheeler called the River Belle, scheduled to depart for St. Louis the following morning. The vessel looked reliable and respectable, without the ostentatious luxury that might make the crew suspicious of passengers who didn't obviously belong to the upper classes. The boat's passenger agent examined Eliza's forged documents with routine thoroughness, scanning the papers that identified her as Elizabeth Washington, a freedwoman traveling to visit relatives in Missouri. The handwriting and official seals satisfied his cursory inspection, and his primary concern seemed to be whether she could afford the fare for second-class passage. Eliza produced the necessary coins from her leather pouch, counting out the required amount while the agent prepared her ticket. The sight of real money seemed to dispel any lingering doubts about her status, for enslaved people rarely possess significant currency, and her calm demeanor suggested someone accustomed to conducting business transactions. That evening she found lodging at a modest boarding house near the waterfront, where the proprietor accepted her payment and asked no probing questions about her origins or destination. The room was small but clean, with a real bed and fresh linens that represented luxuries beyond her previous experience. For the first time in years, she slept without fear of being dragged from her rest by masters seeking entertainment at her expense. Morning brought the sound of steam whistles and shouted orders as the River Belle prepared for departure. Eliza joined the stream of passengers boarding the vessel, her travel bag containing everything she owned in the world and her forged papers ready for any additional inspection. The crew members treated her with professional courtesy, showing her to the second-class accommodations she had purchased. As the steamboat pulled away from the Natchez wharf, Eliza stood at the rail watching the city recede into the distance. Each revolution of the paddle wheels carried her farther from the frozen tomb where the Bellamy family had met their fate and closer to territories where slavery was forbidden by law. The journey upriver took 5 days, during which Eliza maintained a low profile and avoided conversations that might reveal inconsistencies in her carefully constructed identity. She spent hours watching the Mississippi countryside slide past, noting the plantations and towns that dotted the riverbanks like beads on a string. Each mile represented progress toward the freedom she had dreamed of during her years in bondage. Other passengers included merchants conducting business, families relocating to new opportunities, and working people seeking better lives in the growing cities of the Upper River Valley. Most paid little attention to the quiet young black woman who claimed to be visiting relatives, accepting her presence as unremarkable in a region where free people of color were not uncommon. But on the fourth day, Eliza's carefully maintained facade nearly collapsed when she overheard two plantation owners discussing recent events in the Natchez area. According to their conversation, the Bellamy family had been found dead in their icehouse, apparently trapped during the recent blizzard in what authorities were calling a tragic accident. More troubling was their mention of a missing slave from the plantation, a house servant who had disappeared on the same night the family perished. A substantial reward had been offered for information leading to the girl's capture, and professional slave hunters were already combing the region for traces of the fugitive. Eliza forced herself to remain calm and expressionless while listening to their discussion, showing no reaction that might connect her to the events they described. But internally her mind raced with new concerns about the dangers that awaited her even in free territory. Professional bounty hunters would not be easily fooled by forged documents, and the reward money would attract determined pursuers who might follow her trail for hundreds of miles. The River Bell reached St. Louis on a gray March morning, its smokestacks adding to the industrial haze that hung over the bustling river port. The city was larger and more diverse than Natchez, with significant populations of German immigrants, free blacks, and working-class families seeking opportunities in the expanding Western territories. As Eliza disembarked with her fellow passengers, she carried herself with the confidence of someone conducting legitimate business, her forged papers secure and enough money remaining to establish herself while seeking employment. The waterfront bustled with activity as cargo was transferred between boats and trains, passengers embarked for destinations throughout the growing nation, and the complex machinery of 19th-century commerce continued its relentless operation. Within days of her arrival, Eliza had found work in a German woman's dressmaking shop, using skills learned during evening hours in the plantation's sewing room to create fashionable garments for St. Louis's growing middle class. The shop owner, Mrs. Richter, asked few questions about Eliza's background and seemed satisfied with her story of being a freedwoman from New Orleans, seeking better opportunities in the West. The work was demanding but fair, with regular hours and wages that allowed Eliza to rent a small room in a respectable boarding house while saving money for the next stage of her journey to truly free territory. Her fellow workers, mostly German and Irish, immigrant women accepted her presence without question, treating her as simply another working person trying to build a better life in America's expanding economy. But even in St. Louis, Eliza could not entirely escape the shadow of her past. Bounty hunters operated throughout Missouri searching for escaped slaves who thought they had found safety in the state's more cosmopolitan cities. Reward notices appeared regularly in local newspapers describing fugitives and offering substantial payments for their capture and return to bondage. 3 months after her arrival, one such notice made her blood freeze. The description matched her perfectly. A young Negro woman about 17 years old, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a distinctive scar on her left wrist from a childhood accident. The reward had grown to $700, an enormous sum that would attract every professional slave hunter within 500 miles. More ominous was the notice's source. It had been placed by surviving relatives of the Bellamy family, who were apparently unsatisfied with local authorities' conclusion that the deaths had been accidental. They now suspected deliberate murder and wanted the missing slave returned to Mississippi to face trial for killing her masters. The newspaper announcement transformed Eliza from a runaway seeking freedom into a fugitive from murder charges, someone who could not rely on the sympathy that some Northerners felt for escaped slaves. Even abolitionists might hesitate to assist someone accused of killing white children, regardless of the circumstances that had led to such desperate measures. That evening, Eliza began planning her immediate departure from St. Louis, studying maps and transportation schedules while calculating how much money she would need to reach genuinely free territory. Canada beckoned as her ultimate destination, a place where British law protected refugees from American slavery, and bounty hunters could not operate legally. Her escape from St. Louis came with assistance from an unexpected source. Mrs. Richter, who had noticed Eliza's growing nervousness and recognized the signs of someone fleeing danger. The German woman had helped other people in similar circumstances, providing aid to those who needed to travel quickly and quietly to places where they could find safety. Within a week, arrangements had been made for Eliza to join a family of German immigrants traveling to Wisconsin Territory, where she would pose as their domestic servant while crossing through Illinois and into free territory. The family's papers would include documentation of her employment, providing additional legitimacy for her claim to freedom if they were questioned during the journey. The wagon train that carried Eliza away from St. Louis included 15 families seeking farmland in Wisconsin's fertile valleys, plus their livestock, household goods, and dreams of prosperity in America's expanding frontier. For Eliza, hidden among the German immigrants as their hired help, the journey represented her final push toward genuine freedom in territory where slavery had never been legal. The trip took nearly a month, following muddy roads through Illinois as winter gradually yielded to spring. Eliza worked alongside the German women, helping with cooking and child care while maintaining her role as a domestic employee. The family that sheltered her treated her with kindness and respect, understanding without explicit discussion that her life depended on their deception succeeding. As they traveled farther north, Eliza felt the psychological burden of slavery lifting from her shoulders like a physical weight she had carried so long she had forgotten what freedom felt like. Each mile carried her farther from the plantation where she had been property, farther from the Icehouse where she had made her terrible choice, and closer to a place where she could build a life based on her own decisions. Wisconsin Territory in 1841 was a land of endless forests and rich prairies where European immigrants carved farms from the wilderness and built communities based on hard work and mutual cooperation. The territory's laws prohibited slavery, making it genuine sanctuary for escaped bondspeople who could reach its borders and establish themselves as free residents. The German family settled near Milwaukee, where they purchased land and began the difficult work of clearing fields and constructing buildings. Eliza helped them through their first challenging months, then moved to the growing city to establish an independent life using skills acquired during her years in bondage. Milwaukee offered opportunities that would have been unimaginable in the South, with a significant population of free blacks who worked as craftsmen, laborers, and small business owners. Using her sewing abilities, Eliza found employment with a tailor who served the city's German and Yankee families, gradually building a reputation for quality work and reliable service. Within a year, she had saved enough money to rent a small house and establish her own dressmaking business, serving customers who appreciated both her skill with needle and thread and her discretion about their personal affairs. The income allowed her to live comfortably while contributing to the Methodist Church where many black families worshiped. But prosperity brought its own dangers, making Eliza more visible to bounty hunters who still sought the substantial reward offered for her capture. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 transformed every interaction into potential threat, requiring federal officials and ordinary citizens to assist in hunting down escaped slaves even in free states. Milwaukee's black community organized to protect its members, establishing warning networks and safe houses where threatened individuals could hide until danger passed. Eliza contributed money to these efforts while maintaining careful distance from their operations, understanding that her particular circumstances made her more dangerous to help than typical runaways. The Civil War's outbreak in 1861 brought hope that slavery might finally be abolished throughout the United States, ending the legal foundation for the system that had enslaved millions. Eliza followed war news eagerly, attending community meetings where black leaders discussed the conflict's implications for their people. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Eliza joined Milwaukee's celebration of slavery's formal end in the rebel states. The proclamation didn't directly affect her situation, but it validated her decision to fight for freedom and suggested that history would judge her actions more favorably than contemporary opinion. The war's conclusion in 1865 brought the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the nation and eliminated the legal basis for hunting escaped slaves. For the first time since her flight from the plantation, Eliza could consider herself truly free, no longer subject to recapture and return to bondage. As Reconstruction transformed the South and former slaves began building new lives as free citizens, Eliza found herself drawn to the idea of returning to Mississippi to confront her past and perhaps find closure for the choices she had made during that winter night in 1841. In 1868, at age 44, she made the decision to return to Natchez for the first time since her escape. The journey by train took 3 days, carrying her through landscapes that triggered memories of her desperate flight and the family she had left to freeze in their own prison. Natchez had changed dramatically during the war and Reconstruction, its economy disrupted by slavery's end, and its social structure challenged by former slaves' new legal status. The grand mansions still lined the bluffs overlooking the river, but many showed signs of neglect and financial decline. The Bellamy plantation lay 25 miles outside the city, reached by roads that were now little more than dirt tracks winding through abandoned fields. Eliza hired a carriage to take her to the property, uncertain what she expected to find, but compelled by a need to see the place where her life had been shaped by cruelty and transformed by her own courage. The main house still stood but showed decades of neglect, its columns cracked and stained, its windows boarded shut, its grounds overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees. The slave quarters had been demolished, leaving only foundations to mark where families had lived in bondage. The cotton fields had reverted to forest, young trees reclaiming land once worked by enslaved hands. But the Icehouse remained, built with such solid construction that time and weather had barely touched its stone walls and heavy wooden door. Eliza approached the structure with emotions she couldn't name, remembering the brutal cold that had been both her punishment and her weapon. The desperate voices that had called her name as their owners realized they were trapped by their own cruelty. Inside the empty chamber, the shelves stood bare and the ice had long since melted, but the space retained its essential character. The thick walls still held memories of savage cold, the narrow passages still echoed with ghostly voices, and the heavy door still promised imprisonment for anyone unlucky enough to be trapped within. She tried to feel regret for the 4 lives that had ended in this frozen tomb, particularly for the children who had learned cruelty from their parents but might have grown into better people given the chance. But the emotions that filled her were satisfaction and vindication rather than guilt or sorrow. As evening approached, Eliza walked through the plantation ruins one final time, saying goodbye to the place that had shaped her in ways both terrible and profound. The memories were painful but necessary, reminders of how far she had traveled from the frightened slave girl who had once endured casual cruelty as the natural order of the world. The train that carried her back to Milwaukee passed through landscapes transformed by war and freedom, where former slaves worked their own land and their children attended schools previously forbidden to them. She saw freed people building churches and businesses, participating in politics that would have been unthinkable during her youth in bondage. In Milwaukee, Eliza resumed her life with a peace of mind that had eluded her for decades. The nightmares that had troubled her sleep gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future rather than ghosts of the past. She expanded her business, hired assistants, and became more active in community organizations serving the city's African American population. The money she had saved enabled her to purchase the building where she operated her shop, providing financial security and a tangible symbol of the independence she had won through courage and determination. She converted upper floors into apartments for working women, creating a small community that supported each other through urban life's challenges. As years passed, Eliza became something of a legend within Milwaukee's Black community, though few knew the true details of her escape from slavery or the methods she had used to secure her freedom. She was simply Elizabeth Washington, the seamstress who had built a successful business through determination and skill, a living example of what formerly enslaved people could accomplish when given the opportunity to control their own destinies. Young women sought her advice about starting businesses and managing finances, while community leaders valued her contributions to churches and schools. She mentored dozens of girls over the decades, providing jobs in her shop, loans for those starting enterprises, and practical guidance about navigating the complex expectations that governed respectable working women's lives. Eliza never married, finding that the independence she had fought so desperately to achieve was too precious to risk in relationships that might compromise her autonomy. There were suitors over the years, respectable widowers and ambitious professionals who appreciated both her success and her dignity, but none who could accept the emotional barriers she had built to protect herself from vulnerability. The intimacy required for marriage demanded a level of trust that Eliza could never quite offer, having learned too early that even those who claimed to care for her could become instruments of cruelty when it served their purposes. Instead, she channeled her nurturing instincts into helping young women who reminded her of herself, escaped slaves and free-born blacks struggling to build independent lives in a society that offered limited opportunities. As the 19th century drew to a close, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary journey that had carried her from the slave quarters of a Mississippi plantation to prosperity and respect in Wisconsin. The transformation seemed almost impossible when she considered how completely her circumstances had changed, but she understood that every step had been earned through courage, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations others had tried to impose upon her. The Icehouse where she had made her terrible choice was far away and long abandoned, but its lessons remained central to her understanding of herself and the world. Sometimes survival required actions that civilized society would condemn, choices that sacrificed moral purity for practical necessity. She had chosen freedom over submission, her own life over the lives of her oppressors, and she had never regretted that decision even when it haunted her dreams. In 1900, at age 76, Eliza attended a celebration marking the new century's beginning. The gathering included many of Milwaukee's most prominent African-American citizens, successful business owners and professionals who had built impressive lives despite the obstacles placed in their paths by prejudice and discrimination. As she looked around the room at these accomplished men and women, Eliza felt deep satisfaction in what her generation had achieved in the decades since emancipation. The young people at the celebration knew her as Elizabeth Washington, the elderly seamstress who had somehow accumulated enough wealth to own property and support various community causes. They respected her for her business success and generosity, but they couldn't imagine the experiences that had shaped her or the choices that had made her prosperity possible. That evening, as Eliza returned to her comfortable home, she thought about the story she had never told, the truth about her escape from slavery and the methods she had used to secure her freedom. The details were too dangerous to share while she lived, for there might still be those who would judge her harshly for the deaths of the Bellamy family, regardless of the circumstances that had led to their demise. But perhaps, she thought, there would come a time when her story could be told honestly, when people would understand that slavery had been a system so brutal and dehumanizing that it had sometimes required brutal methods to escape. The 4 people who had died in the Icehouse had been casualties of their own cruelty, victims of a system that had taught them to treat other human beings as property to be abused at will. The newspapers of her later years occasionally carried stories from the South that mentioned the mysterious deaths of the Bellamy family, keeping alive rumors about the slave girl who had disappeared on the same night they perished. Some reports described her as a murderer who had deliberately trapped her masters, while others portrayed her as a victim who had simply seized an opportunity to escape when tragedy struck. The truth was more complex than either version suggested. Eliza lived for another 15 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1915 at age 91. She left behind a modest estate that she donated to schools and churches serving Milwaukee's African-American community, along with a sealed envelope containing a detailed account of her escape from slavery and the events that had made her freedom possible. The document remained unopened for 40 years, finally discovered by researchers studying the Underground Railroad and the experiences of escaped slaves in Wisconsin. When its contents were revealed, they created intense debate among historians and civil rights activists who struggled to reconcile the violence of Eliza's methods with the nobility of her cause. For those who understood the true nature of slavery and the desperation it created in its victims, Eliza's story served as a powerful reminder that freedom sometimes demanded a price that few were willing to pay. She had been willing to pay that price, accepting the moral burden of 4 deaths in exchange for her own liberation and the chance to build a life based on her own choices rather than the whims of cruel masters. The Icehouse, where the Bellamy family had met their fate, became the subject of local legends in Mississippi, where some claimed it was haunted by the ghosts of the frozen family while others insisted it was protected by the spirit of the slave girl who had turned their own cruelty against them. Historians who studied the incident could never definitively prove that Eliza had deliberately trapped her masters, but the timing of their deaths and her disappearance suggested a connection that went beyond mere coincidence. Local residents began calling her the Ice Witch of Natchez, a title that captured both the fear and grudging respect her actions had inspired among those who heard the story. The legend grew over time, with each telling adding new details about the young slave who had outsmarted her masters and escaped to freedom while leaving them to freeze in their own prison. Some versions of the tale portrayed Eliza as a supernatural figure with powers beyond those of ordinary mortals, while others described her as simply a clever girl who had used her knowledge of the plantation against those who oppressed her. The truth lay somewhere between these extremes in the story of a desperate young woman who had refused to accept the fate that others had planned for her. The abandoned plantation eventually returned to wilderness, its buildings crumbling and its fields reclaimed by forest. But the Icehouse remained, its stone walls too solid to succumb to weather and time, standing as a monument to the night when power had shifted between master and slave in ways that would echo through generations. Visitors who found their way to the ruins sometimes reported strange sensations near the Icehouse, feelings of cold that seemed to emanate from the structure even on warm summer days. Whether these experiences reflected supernatural activity or simply the psychological power of a place where such dramatic events had occurred, they served to keep Eliza's story alive in local memory. In her final written account, Eliza reflected on the choices she had made and the life she had built with the freedom those choices had purchased. She expressed no regret for the actions that had secured her liberty, understanding that the alternative would have been a life of continued bondage followed by death as someone else's property. The 4 people who had died in the Icehouse had chosen to use that frozen chamber as a weapon against her, and she had simply demonstrated that weapons could be turned against those who wielded them. Her legacy was not the violence that had secured her freedom, but the life she had built with that freedom once it was won. She had transformed herself from property into person, from victim into victor, proving that the human spirit could triumph over even the most dehumanizing circumstances when armed with courage, intelligence, and an absolute determination to survive. The story of Eliza Monroe, who became Elizabeth Washington, stands as testament to the countless unnamed heroes who fought for their freedom during the darkest chapters of American history, using whatever weapons were available to them in their struggle against oppression. Her methods may have been harsh, but her cause was just, and her ultimate success proved that even the most powerless could find ways to claim the freedom that was their birthright as human beings. In the modern era, historians and activists continue to debate the moral implications of Eliza's actions, with some condemning the violence she used while others argue that slavery itself was such a violent system that extreme measures were justified in escaping it. These debates reflect broader questions about the relationship between violence and justice, between individual survival and moral purity, that remain relevant in contemporary discussions of oppression and resistance. What cannot be debated is the courage Eliza displayed in seizing control of her own destiny, refusing to accept the role that others had assigned to her and creating a new identity based on her own choices rather than the whims of cruel masters. She had looked into the face of a system designed to crush her spirit and had found the strength to fight back, using the tools available to her in ways her oppressors never anticipated. The ice witch of Natchez had melted away into history, but the woman she became lived on in the communities she had served, the businesses she had built, and the example she had set for those who came after her. Freedom, she had learned, was not something that could be given or taken away by others, but something that had to be claimed and defended by those brave enough to pay its price. Her story reminds us that the path to freedom is rarely simple or morally pure, that sometimes survival requires choices that challenge our comfortable assumptions about right and wrong. Eliza Monroe had faced such a choice on a frozen February night in 1841, and she had chosen life over death, freedom over bondage, her own destiny over the plans that others had made for her. In making that choice, she had joined the ranks of those who refused to accept oppression as their natural condition, who fought back against systems designed to dehumanize them, and who proved that the human spirit could not be permanently caged by those who sought to profit from others' suffering. The ice witch of Natchez had become something far more powerful and enduring, a symbol of resistance, a proof of possibility, and a reminder that freedom is always worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The decades following Eliza's death brought dramatic changes to the American South as the civil rights movement challenged the system of segregation that had replaced slavery as the primary means of controlling African American lives. During these turbulent times, historians and activists began searching for stories that could inspire new generations of freedom fighters, and Eliza's tale gradually emerged from obscurity to become a powerful symbol of resistance against oppression. The discovery of her written account in 1955 coincided with the Montgomery bus boycott, when Rosa Parks's refusal to give up her seat sparked a year-long protest that demonstrated the power of organized resistance to injustice. Civil rights leaders found in Eliza's story a historical precedent for their own struggles, a reminder that African Americans had been fighting for freedom long before the modern movement began. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself referenced Eliza's story in a sermon delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, describing her as an example of someone who had refused to accept the role that society had assigned to her based on race and circumstance. He noted that while her methods had been extreme, they reflected the extremity of the system she had been fighting against, and her ultimate success proved that determination and courage could overcome even the most overwhelming obstacles. But the story also sparked controversy within the civil rights movement, as some leaders worried that celebrating violence, even violence used in self-defense or the pursuit of freedom, might undermine their commitment to nonviolent resistance. They argued that Eliza's tale, while inspiring in many ways, sent the wrong message about acceptable methods for achieving social change. Others disagreed, pointing out that Eliza had lived in an era when peaceful protest was impossible and legal remedies were non-existent for enslaved people seeking freedom. They argued that judging her actions by 20th century standards was unfair, and that her story demonstrated the courage and resourcefulness that had enabled previous generations to survive and eventually overcome the institution of slavery. The debate over Eliza's legacy reflected broader tensions within the civil rights movement about the relationship between violence and social change, tensions that would become more pronounced as the movement evolved through the 1960s and beyond. Her story became a touchstone for these discussions, cited by both advocates of nonviolence and those who argued that more militant approaches might sometimes be necessary. Academic scholars began studying Eliza's case as part of broader research into slave resistance and women's roles in the antebellum South. They found that her story, while dramatic in its details, reflected patterns of resistance that had been more common than previously understood. Enslaved people had regularly used their knowledge of plantation operations against their oppressors, though few had done so as decisively or effectively as Eliza. Feminist historians were particularly interested in Eliza's story as an example of how enslaved women had navigated the particular vulnerabilities they faced under slavery. The sexual threats that Harrison Bellamy had made against her were typical of the dangers that enslaved women encountered daily, and her refusal to submit to such treatment represented a form of resistance that required enormous courage given the potential consequences. These scholars noted that Eliza's transformation from property to successful businesswoman challenged stereotypes about enslaved people's capabilities and ambitions. Her ability to forge documents, navigate complex legal and financial systems, and build a thriving enterprise demonstrated skills and intelligence that slavery's defenders had claimed African Americans did not possess. The story also attracted attention from researchers studying the Underground Railroad and the networks that had helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Eliza's journey illustrated both the formal assistance provided by abolitionists and the informal help she had received from sympathetic individuals who had risked their own safety to aid her escape. Mrs. Richter, the German seamstress who had helped Eliza leave St. Louis, became the subject of separate historical investigation as scholars sought to understand the motivations of European immigrants who had assisted escaped slaves. They found that many German immigrants, having fled political oppression in their homeland, felt natural sympathy for others seeking freedom from tyranny. The family that had sheltered Eliza during her journey to Wisconsin represented another type of Underground Railroad participant, people who had provided assistance without necessarily being part of formal abolitionist organizations. Their willingness to help reflected both moral conviction and practical understanding that their own success as immigrants depended partly on creating communities where all people could thrive. As Eliza's story became better known, it inspired artistic works that explored its themes of resistance, transformation, and the cost of freedom. A novel published in 1968 reimagined her tale as a broader allegory about African American women's struggles for independence and respect. The book became a bestseller and introduced Eliza's story to readers who might never have encountered it through historical accounts. A documentary film produced in 1975 used archival footage, dramatic reenactments, and interviews with historians to examine both the specific details of Eliza's escape and the broader context of slave resistance in the antebellum South. The film won several awards and helped establish her story as an important part of African American historical narrative. Musicians also found inspiration in Eliza's tale, with folk singers and blues artists creating songs that celebrated her courage while acknowledging the moral complexity of her choices. These musical interpretations often emphasize themes of survival and transformation, portraying her as a symbol of the strength that had enabled African Americans to endure and overcome centuries of oppression. The abandoned Bellamy plantation, meanwhile, became an unexpected tourist destination as people sought to visit the site where Eliza had made her historic choice. The Icehouse, still standing after more than a century, drew visitors who wanted to see the place where she had turned the tables on her oppressors. Local entrepreneurs developed tours that told her story while also educating visitors about the broader history of slavery in Mississippi. These tourist visits sometimes created tension with local residents who had grown up with different versions of the story or who preferred not to confront the darker aspects of their region's history. Some descendants of plantation families objected to what they saw as the celebration of violence against their ancestors, while others argued that understanding the past honestly was necessary for meaningful reconciliation. The Mississippi Historical Society eventually installed a marker at the plantation site that attempted to present a balanced account of the events while acknowledging their significance in the broader story of resistance to slavery. The marker's text went through multiple revisions as historians, community leaders, and descendants of various participants debated how the story should be remembered and interpreted. Archaeological investigations of the plantation site revealed additional details about life in the slave quarters and the operations that had sustained the Bellamy family's wealth. Researchers found evidence of the hidden spaces where enslaved people had concealed personal possessions and conducted activities forbidden by their masters, providing physical confirmation of the resistance networks that had existed throughout the plantation system. The Icehouse itself became the subject of detailed study as historians sought to understand exactly how the Bellamy family had died and whether Eliza's account of events was accurate. Forensic experts examined the structure's design and concluded that her description of the ventilation system and locking mechanism was consistent with the building's actual construction. These investigations confirmed that the Icehouse could indeed have functioned as both prison and tomb under the circumstances Eliza had described. The thick stone walls and heavy wooden door would have made escape impossible once the lock was secured from outside, while the sub-freezing temperatures would have killed the trapped occupants within hours of exposure. Weather records from February 1841 supported Eliza's account of the blizzard that had provided cover for her escape, with temperature readings confirming that the storm had been one of the most severe in the region's recorded history. The combination of extreme cold and high winds would have made travel extremely dangerous for anyone not properly prepared for the conditions. Modern medical experts who reviewed the case concluded that the Bellamy family would have died from hypothermia within 4 to 6 hours of being trapped in the Icehouse, with the children succumbing first due to their smaller body mass and reduced ability to generate heat. The adults would have remained conscious longer, experiencing the full horror of their situation before cold and exhaustion finally claimed them. These scientific analyses removed any remaining doubt about whether Eliza's actions had actually caused the family's deaths, confirming that her decision to lock them in the Icehouse had been directly responsible for their demise. This evidence intensified debates about the moral implications of her choices while also demonstrating the deadly effectiveness of her improvised revenge. Legal scholars who studied the case noted that Eliza would likely have faced murder charges if captured and returned to Mississippi, despite the circumstances that had motivated her actions. 19th-century law provided no recognition of self-defense rights for enslaved people, and her killing of white children would have been viewed as an unforgivable crime, regardless of their treatment of her. These legal realities highlighted the impossible position that enslaved people had faced when confronting abuse from their masters. The law offered them no protection from even the most extreme cruelty, while simultaneously holding them fully accountable for any resistance they offered. Eliza's escape to free territory had been essential not just for her freedom but for her very survival. Contemporary discussions of Eliza's story often focus on its relevance to modern struggles for justice and equality. Activists and scholars draw parallels between her situation and current cases of people who use extreme measures to escape or resist oppression, noting that moral judgments about such actions often depend on one's perspective about the legitimacy of the systems being resisted. Educational curricula that include Eliza's story typically emphasize its value in helping students understand the complexities of historical decision-making and the ways that ordinary people can become agents of significant change. Teachers use her tale to explore questions about civil disobedience, the relationship between law and morality, and the factors that drive people to take desperate measures in pursuit of freedom. The story has also found its way into discussions about trauma and resilience, as psychologists and social workers examine how Eliza managed to transform herself from victim to survivor to successful community leader. Her ability to build a new identity and create meaningful relationships despite her traumatic experiences provides insights into the factors that enable some people to overcome extreme adversity. Mental health professionals note that Eliza's case illustrates both the lasting effects of trauma and the human capacity for healing and growth. Her nightmares and emotional walls represented natural responses to the horrors she had experienced, while her eventual success in business and community service demonstrated that traumatic experiences need not define or limit a person's future possibilities. The geographical aspects of Eliza's story have attracted attention from scholars studying migration patterns and the development of African American communities in the upper Midwest. Her journey from Mississippi to Wisconsin reflected broader patterns of movement that would accelerate during the Great Migration of the early 20th century, when millions of African Americans left the South seeking better opportunities in northern cities. Milwaukee's role as a destination for escaped slaves and later migrants highlighted the city's position as a gateway to freedom and opportunity for African Americans throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Eliza's success in establishing herself there contributed to the development of institutions and networks that would later assist other newcomers seeking to build better lives. Urban historians have studied how Eliza's business contributed to the development of Milwaukee's African American commercial district, where Black-owned enterprises served both Black and white customers while providing economic opportunities that would have been unavailable in the South. Her dressmaking shop represented one of many small businesses that formed the foundation of the city's African American middle class. The entrepreneurial aspects of Eliza's story have made it popular among business educators who use her case to illustrate principles of innovation, risk management, and community development. They note that her transformation of skills learned in bondage into the foundation for a successful enterprise demonstrated the kind of resourcefulness and adaptability that characterize successful entrepreneurs in any era. Economic historians have calculated that Eliza's business at its peak generated annual revenues equivalent to several $100,000 in current currency, making her one of the wealthiest African American women in 19th century Wisconsin. This economic success challenged prevailing assumptions about African Americans' business capabilities, while demonstrating the potential that had been suppressed under slavery. The religious dimensions of Eliza's story have attracted attention from scholars studying African American spiritual traditions and their role in sustaining communities through periods of oppression and change. Her active participation in Methodist church life reflected broader patterns of religious engagement that provided both spiritual comfort and practical support for formerly enslaved people adapting to freedom. Theologians have examined the moral questions raised by Eliza's actions, exploring how different religious traditions might evaluate her decision to kill her oppressors in pursuit of freedom. These discussions often focus on concepts of just war, self-defense, and the tension between individual survival and moral purity that characterizes many ethical dilemmas. The story's literary qualities have made it popular among writers and critics who appreciate its combination of historical significance and dramatic power. The tale contains elements of thriller, adventure story, and social commentary that have inspired numerous fictional adaptations while maintaining its basis in historical fact. Creative writers have found in Eliza's story a rich source of material for exploring themes of identity, transformation, and moral complexity. Her journey from enslaved girl to successful businesswoman provides a framework for examining how people reinvent themselves in response to changing circumstances and opportunities. The international dimensions of Eliza's story have attracted attention from scholars studying slavery and freedom as global phenomena. Her consideration of Canada as a potential destination reflected the international nature of the Underground Railroad and the ways that enslaved people understood freedom as something that transcended national boundaries. Comparative historians have examined Eliza's case alongside similar stories from other slave societies, noting both common patterns of resistance and unique features of the American experience. These comparisons highlight the universal human desire for freedom while illustrating how specific historical and cultural contexts shape the methods people use to pursue that freedom. The technological aspects of Eliza's escape, particularly her use of forged documents and altered records, have interested scholars studying information systems and identity construction in the 19th century. Her ability to manipulate written records demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how bureaucratic systems functioned and could be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and skill. Digital historians have created online resources that allow people to trace Eliza's journey using historical maps, transportation records, and other archival materials. These interactive presentations help contemporary audiences understand the practical challenges she faced while highlighting the courage required to undertake such a dangerous escape. The preservation of sites associated with Eliza's story has become a focus for historical conservationists who recognize their importance in telling the complete story of American slavery and resistance. Efforts to maintain the Icehouse and other surviving structures from the Bellamy plantation have generated both support and controversy as communities grapple with how to commemorate difficult historical events. Museum professionals have developed exhibitions that use Eliza's story to explore broader themes of slavery, resistance, and freedom. These displays often combine historical artifacts with interactive elements that help visitors understand the choices she faced and the courage required to pursue freedom under such dangerous circumstances. The psychological profile that emerges from Eliza's documented actions and decisions has fascinated researchers studying personality and behavior under extreme stress. Her ability to plan and execute such a complex escape while maintaining emotional control suggests unusual levels of intelligence, determination, and psychological resilience. Behavioral scientists have examined how Eliza's childhood experiences of trauma and loss may have contributed to the emotional detachment that enabled her to act decisively when the opportunity for revenge and escape presented itself. Her case illustrates how early adversity can sometimes produce strengths and capabilities that prove crucial in later crisis situations. The leadership qualities that Eliza demonstrated throughout her life, from her escape planning to her community involvement in Milwaukee, have made her story popular among management educators and organizational development specialists. Her ability to inspire and mentor other women while building successful business operations demonstrated skills that remain relevant in contemporary leadership contexts. Social network analysts have studied how Eliza built and maintained relationships that supported her transformation from escaped slave to community leader. Her case illustrates the importance of social capital in enabling individuals to overcome significant obstacles and achieve success in new environments. The gender dynamics of Eliza's story continue to generate scholarly interest as researchers examine how enslaved women navigated the particular vulnerabilities they faced while also demonstrating remarkable strength and resourcefulness. Her refusal to submit to sexual exploitation represented a form of resistance that required extraordinary courage given the potential consequences. Women's studies scholars have noted that Eliza's economic independence and decision to remain unmarried challenged 19th-century assumptions about women's proper roles while demonstrating alternative models of female success and fulfillment. Her life illustrated possibilities that were available to women who possessed sufficient courage and determination to pursue them. The story's enduring popularity reflects its combination of dramatic narrative with important historical and moral themes that continue to resonate with contemporary audiences. Eliza's transformation from victim to victor provides inspiration while also challenging readers to consider difficult questions about violence, justice, and the price of freedom. Educational institutions throughout the United States now include Eliza's story in curricula designed to provide students with more complete and nuanced understanding of American history. Her tale illustrates the human dimensions of historical events while demonstrating how individual choices can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. The Ice Witch of Natchez had become far more than a local legend or historical curiosity. She had evolved into a symbol of resistance, transformation, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to accept oppression as permanent or inevitable. Her story reminds us that freedom is never free, that justice sometimes requires difficult choices, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it and courage permits it.